Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching HMS Victory, Sailing and Fighting a Napoleonic Warship by Epic History TV. This is the second episode in their series on the HMS Victory. Last time we got a very in-depth look at how the ship was designed, what each compartment contained, and a look at the crew as well. This time we're going to get even more detail. I'm excited to get into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
HMS Victory. One of Britain's most powerful warships in an age when Britain dominated the seas.
An age when Britain dominated the seas, this was perhaps the most powerful tool, the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. I mean, these were, these really made the early British Empire. Like the dreadnoughts of a later age, these were the masters of the sea. That's why they're so important.
During the Napoleonic Wars, such ships were Britain's wooden walls, protecting the homeland from invasion, while devastating enemy commerce and protecting Allied shipping. Ships of the line were the largest and most sophisticated war machines of the conflict. Britain had around 140 in total, more than any other nation.
Wow.
But her advantage came less from numbers or better ship design than the qualities of the men who sailed them.
I'm interested to learn about that in this video. They mentioned last time we were going to get more of that. And as we talked about last time, I have a little bit of knowledge of this era, but mainly my knowledge of sailing comes from the late early 1700s, and is associated with my knowledge of piracy. And from the comments you guys left, it seems that a lot had changed from the early 1700s to the late 1700s and early 1800s. Seems like it might have been sort of a different environment, different conditions for the sailors in the Navy. So I'm actually pretty excited to learn the details.
Bold and experienced commanders, disciplined and eager crews, all full of confidence and accustomed to victory.
I mean, we think about Napoleon's Grande Armée, how they performed on land, the talent, the discipline, the skill, the confidence, how high the morale would have been for a lot of their time fighting, because it was victory after victory. This is sort of the equivalent of that for Britain. These sailors, victory after victory, they rule the seas, so you can imagine, the confidence they must have felt, and the morale, how high it must have been due to, British domination, just like Napoleon dominated on land.
This video is sponsored by War Thunder, the most comprehensive combined arms combat game ever made. With more, will receive a large...
So you guys know the deal. Shout out to Epic History TV. Please go and check out their video, which is linked down below. Go and give them a like, subscribe to their channel, and please check out their sponsor. Show them some support for making these fantastic videos.
Free bonus pack, including premium...
And especially go check out their sponsor, because this is a new video, so they'll still be making money from that. So go check it out.
Vehicles, premium account, boosters, and more. Thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video.
The crew, okay, here we go.
At the height of the Napoleonic Wars, around 145,000 men served in Britain's Royal Navy.
Wow.
A number comparable to European field armies of the period. Ships of the line, like HMS Victory, required huge crews, not so much to sail her, as to man her heavy guns. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, she had 820 men aboard, a little short of her full complement of 850. Just 15 of these men were commissioned officers. One admiral commanding the fleet, one captain in command of the ship, 9 naval lieutenants, and 4 Royal Marine officers. Then the senior warrant officers, including the ship's master in charge of navigation, the gunner, responsible for the ship's guns, small arms, powder, and shot, the boatswain, responsible for sails and rigging, and who with his mates oversaw all work on deck. 2 ship's carpenters, responsible for keeping the ship afloat and making repairs, the purser, in charge of ship's provisions, a surgeon for the crew's physical welfare, and a chaplain for their spiritual.
I mean, yeah, it really is comparable. The whole fleet is comparable to a field army on land, but each ship is comparable to, a smaller unit. They've got everything they need to be self-sufficient. Of course, even more than an army because they're at sea. They need all the supplies. But, they really have a lot of different roles in order to keep this ship going, to man the guns, to keep this, what is essentially a community, running, surviving, strong, able to fight. It's really, fascinating, all these different roles. Of course, as we're going to see on this list, most of the men did not have a particular or high-up role like that. We're going to see we have a lot of midshipmen
Victory
here, for
also
example.
had 21 midshipmen. These were young cadet officers, some of whom began their naval careers at just 13.
Wow.
They served a 6-year apprenticeship at sea, learning seamanship, sail handling, navigation, mathematics, and trigonometry. They'd then be qualified to sit the lieutenant's exam, a rigorous assessment by a board of naval captains. Further promotion to commander, then captain, would depend on merit and, crucially, social and political connections.
Of course.
The process could be hugely frustrating for those without influential friends.
I mean, look, we're talking about the military of this era, late 18th century, early 19th century. It is still very much, a boys' club. And I mean that in the strictest possible definition. You have to be connected to get in. This was one of the things that frustrated people, say, in Ancien Regime or Old Regime France before the Revolution, was that their military was extremely bloated by all these commissioned officers who were only officers because of their political connections or their mainly aristocratic status. And there were a lot of talented young officers who couldn't work their way up because they were not allowed to be in the higher ranks of the army. France solved that through the revolution. They had a revolution, they murdered a bunch of their nobles, and that opened up a lot of positions for these talented young officers who were not aristocratic. They weren't nobles. They came from humble backgrounds. That was a lot of Napoleon's marshals. They were middle class, and the revolution gave them an opportunity to rise up that they never would have had before. Of course, Britain did not have a similar revolution, and so I imagine they're still saddled with some of these issues where you really do need political connections or wealth to rise up. Though, Britain's aristocracy at this point was not nearly as powerful as France's aristocracy was before the revolution, so it's probably not as bad.
As satirized in this cartoon by the famous illustrator George Cruikshank. Some naval officers came from aristocratic families, but most were from what today we'd call the middle classes. HMS Victory carried 43...
A note on that, Britain was far more bourgeois than France was, due to their early development of industry and capitalism, and so pretty quickly, Britain's aristocracy sort of faded into the background as the new ruling class took power. These early capitalists, these very wealthy bourgeois individuals, versus France before the revolution, where it still was very noble-dominated.
3 clerks, orderlies, stewards, and servants to assist the officers. 69 junior warrant officers, petty officers, and their mates held various specialist roles, such as coxswain, armourer, and sailmaker. There were 212 able seamen, the veteran sailors.
Yeah, and so here we get to the vast majority of men. They don't have a specialized role. They're just general seamen, whether more or less experienced.
193 ordinary seamen with at least a year's service. 87 landsmen, mostly new recruits, only good for hauling on ropes. 142 Royal Marine non-commissioned officers and privates, soldiers who fought at sea, led amphibious landings, and enforced discipline. And 31 ship's boys, many of them orphans plucked from destitution, now destined for a life at sea.
Yep.
Each man was assigned a station for every maneuver. Top men were the fittest, bravest sailors who handled the sails high above deck. Forecastle men were knowledgeable veterans who handled anchors and bowsprit sails. The waisters in the ship's waist and afterguard on the quarterdeck and poop were for hauling on ropes. The crew was organized into two halves, the larboard watch and starboard watch. They took turns on and off duty, except for emergencies when all hands were called on deck.
I mean, there really is, and I said this last time, there's so much new terminology. For someone like me who's completely unfamiliar with, say, naval terms, naval terminology, I'm not much of a military historian in general, but I'm definitely more familiar with land armies than navies at sea. And I imagine, there's probably a lot of new terminology if you're a sailor plucked off the streets of London or something, and you enter into this organization. There's a lot of different stuff to learn there. A lot of different roles, different terminology for parts of the ship. It can be a little overwhelming at times, but I'm sure a lot of you have a lot more knowledge of these terms and how they're used.
They were further organized into divisions, each commanded by a lieutenant responsible for his men's welfare and conduct. HMS Victory's crew, like that of most British warships, was surprisingly cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
Most.
That is one feature of the sea that I am familiar with, and this goes back through the entire 18th century. If you look at, whether they be ships in the Navy or merchant ships, the crews of these ships were, as I said, very cosmopolitan. They were from all across the British Isles and often all across Europe, the Americas, Africa. There were a lot of sailors from a lot of different places because, sailing was not, I would say, a super highly ranked profession. It was a very working class thing to do. And so if you're someone with no other opportunities, wherever you are, becoming a sailor was, something to do. A way to get out of where you were. You probably wouldn't become rich from doing it, but, you could at least have a job under some pretty tough conditions. So I think that is partially why it's so cosmopolitan. Of course, the sea also represents this link between the entire Atlantic world, obviously the Pacific, but we're talking about the Atlantic here, between, North, South, Central America, Africa, Europe, and it sort of represents all of these people, coming together for not necessarily a common purpose. They were often opposed, but coming together to do, one thing. Whether it be sail in the Navy or a merchant ship or a pirate ship. It definitely was pretty diverse.
Most were from Britain and Ireland, but about 10% were foreigners, including Americans, Italians, Dutch, Maltese, and West Indians. About half were volunteers. The rest had been impressed, meaning they'd been forced into military service by the Navy's notorious press gangs. These naval recruitment parties scoured ports and passing ships for British sailors, all of whom were considered fair game for compulsory enlistment. The process was not always entirely peaceful.
No, the press gangs were known for their violence. And this is part of what I was talking about last time, some of the brutality of life at sea. For many people, it began before they even got on the ship. Now, this may sound shocking to us, because, today our militaries are very well-respected institutions. But in this era, that really often was not the case. Now, a big part of that change was Napoleon. Napoleon built up an army of volunteers and then conscripts, but a respectable force of men who truly believed in their country and believed on the mission that they were on. But before that, armies were often made up of the lowest of the low, the poorest of the poor, people who really had no other option. And this was true for the Navy as well. And so, yeah, these press gangs would roam the streets of British port cities, and any sailors they found who were otherwise unoccupied, or sometimes not otherwise unoccupied, could be pressed, forced into service. Like they said, oftentimes violently. They'd beat them and drag them onto the ship, or sometimes through trickery. They'd offer them an opportunity, lure them onto the ship, and before you know it, bam, you're at sea. What choice do you have? Or still coercive, but I suppose a little less bad, they'd offer them with promises of payment, which they often wouldn't provide. They'd say, hey, we'll give you this much wages if you come and serve with the Navy, and then they wouldn't pay them. So it was a pretty duplicitous position to be in, and pretty abusive. Not to mention, what a lot of Americans might know about impressment is the impressment of American sailors. British naval ships would come across American merchant ships, and they would impress sailors from those American ships and force them to join the Navy. Oftentimes, they were British citizens who were trying to flee from service, but also they were oftentimes Americans who had no interest in serving in the British Navy, but they couldn't resist, of course, because these press gangs were violent. So impressment is definitely, from a different era, a time when, very little respect was shown to the common soldier, the common seaman. They were not revered members of society. Like I said, they were the lowest of the low. They were people who could be easily abused. And, this is just a great example of that.
Navy press gangs were feared and despised by civilians.
Yeah.
They were known to seize men who were not sailors, or even British, though most were later released if they could prove their identity.
Key on if they could prove their identity. This is not an era in which most people have a lot of paperwork. And this was the issue, was that when the Brits were going to American ships and impressing sailors, the Brits said, well, we're just, impressing British citizens. We have a right to do that. It just so happened that a lot of those British citizens they were impressing were actually Americans. But most people don't have paperwork to prove that. So it becomes very fuzzy, right? And so, sure, if you had the paperwork to prove it, they'd let you go. But if you're just like a poor working class American who's been dragged off your merchant ship to go serve in the Navy, you're going to have a hard time getting out of that.
And there were limits. Contrary to popular myth, the Navy did not press vagrants, nor did it accept criminals convicted of serious crimes.
All right.
To get the best out of a ship like Victory, the captain had to know his crew and his ship. Every vessel has its own best point of sailing relative to the wind. HMS Victory's was 1 or 2 points off her stern. This means she made her best speed, around 10 knots, sailing in these directions. But large ships do not sail in a straight line due to leeway, the effect of the wind pushing the ship's hull sideways. This was something the helmsman steering the ship at the ship's wheel had to correct for. The officer of the watch, usually a lieutenant, was responsible for the ship when on duty, and ordered which sails to set and take in. He would summon the captain if the situation required it. In strong winds, Victory might sail under topsails alone, perhaps with a jib and flying jib. In lighter winds, she would crowd on sail, adding courses, to'garnsails, and royals. She might even run out the stunsail booms to set studding sails, pronounced stunsails.
Fantastic animation.
This was known as sailing large. But if the wind picked up, stunsails and royals had to be brought in quickly, as spars and sails could be damaged or torn away by a sudden strong gust. No sailing ship can sail directly into the wind. Victory's closest point of sail was 6 points off the wind. This was known as sailing close-hauled or on a bowline. There were two methods of sailing against the wind. The first was tacking. This zigzag approach required precise sail handling and could strain spars and rigging.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of really good information. I don't necessarily have too much commentary to add, because this is stuff I'm completely unfamiliar with. But, you know, we're, let's say, around the year 1800. It really is remarkable how, in a couple of decades, all of this will be completely revolutionized by the invention of the steamship. You know, a lot of this will become more and more irrelevant as time goes on, you know, due to steam-powered engines. And, you know, this whole thing will be revolutionized in, you know, not that long. It really is kind of crazy to think about that, because obviously before that, they were sailing by the wind and by manpower for as long as they were sailing, you know. Since the first person had gotten on a boat, that's how they were doing it. And then you get around the mid-1800s, it all changes. And this right here, this is like right at the end of that. Because we're, you know, right sort of at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And those inventions are going to come in the next few years following the Napoleonic Wars. So it's just something to sort of keep in mind for a bit of historical context.
The alternative was wearing ship, an easier maneuver to perform, but slower, as it meant going the long way around. Anchoring a large warship like Victory was also a complex operation. The sea's depth was discovered by casting the lead, literally throwing a lead weight tied to a rope into the sea. The rope clearly marked every fathom, or 6 feet. The preferred depth for anchoring was 40 fathoms or less, though it was possible in deeper water. First, the ship reduced speed by taking in sail. When the ship came to a halt, the anchor was let go, with a marker buoy attached. As current and backed sails began to drive the ship sternwards, the anchor cable was run out, using 3 times the length needed to reach the sea bottom. It was the weight of this giant cable, as much as the anchor, that kept the ship in position.
Wow. That's interesting.
Depending on weather, tide, and sea bottom, it might be necessary to set several of Victory's anchors to keep the ship safely moored. A less well-known inshore maneuver was kedging. This was a way to drag the ship against wind or tide using manpower alone. The lighter kedge anchor was carried in a ship's boat, rowed out ahead of the ship, and let go. The crew then turned the capstan to haul the ship towards the anchor.
Jeez. I mean, we were just talking about, or I was just talking about, the invention of steam power and how that is to come. Or, I don't know what year steam power was invented in, but if we're talking about this, say it was afterwards, you know, right now, we're still using manpower. And it's crazy to think about how much manpower it would use to move a ship like this. Or, we talked about it last time, to perform any of the operations of this ship. It's an incredible amount of energy just from, you know, no technology, steam technology, you know, electricals, just any technology is powered by the individuals on the ship. Pulleys and all that kind of stuff. It's crazy to think about.
This exhausting process was repeated as many times as necessary to move the ship into position. Another version of this was warping. in which ropes were attached to a fixed object, like a strong tree on shore, and the ship hauled towards it.
That's a lot of faith in that tree, huh? Ooh, okay, I'm excited for this part.
In naval combat, the first consideration was always the direction and strength of the wind. A ship upwind or to windward had the advantage and was said to have the weather gauge. She could choose if and when to initiate battle.
Yeah, I'm always curious about how exactly naval maneuvers in combat would work, because obviously you are very much reliant on the direction of the wind. So how much can you really maneuver if you're reliant on the direction of the wind, just like your opponent is reliant on the direction of the wind? I don't know. I suspect I'm going to learn a little bit about that here.
While the ship to leeward had to struggle into the wind to reach her adversary. Ships of all nations sometimes flew a false flag, that of another nation, to hide their identity.
Pirates did this as well. We talked about this last time. This was a pretty common pirate tactic, but, it was not above professional naval forces. I mean, you gotta use all the tricks in the book in order to gain an advantage, right?
This was considered fair practice, but to fire on an enemy without first hoisting your true colors was an unpardonable crime.
Okay, interesting.
When about to engage the enemy, the captain would order, "Beat to quarters." To the rattle of the Marines' drums, the ship was cleared for action. All temporary cabins on gun decks were dismantled and taken to the hold, so gun crews could work without obstruction. The sick bay was cleared away and all its patients carried down to the orlop deck.
Wow, it's such an operation, just to get everybody ready to fight. We're not even at the firing of the cannons yet, but we have to clear out all this stuff and move it further down in order to get everybody into position. I mean, I keep repeating myself, but it's quite a remarkable operation.
The galley stove was put out to reduce the risk of fire, and ammunition was moved up from the magazines to the gun decks. The ship's boats were launched and towed behind the ship. Here they were less likely to be smashed to splinters by enemy fire, and were immediately ready for any emergency.
Yeah.
Sand was poured on the deck for traction, while splinter netting was put up above the decks to protect men from any falling spars or pulleys shot down by enemy fire.
Ah, okay, that's what that's for.
Every man then took up his station for battle. Captain and officers in full uniform on the quarterdeck. Topmen aloft, ready to trim sail. Sharpshooters on the fighting tops. Carpenter's crew on the orlop deck, ready to plug holes below the waterline. Gunner's mates in the magazine, filling extra cartridges. The surgeon in the cockpit, ready to receive casualties. For 3/4 of the crew, battle stations meant the gun decks, manning one of the ship's 104 guns. It was a huge amount of firepower for the age, and made her one of the most heavily armed warships in the world.
God damn. And like we said last time, there's nothing else that's comparable in this era. I mean, there's no tanks. We gotta wait another 100 years for those. So this is the most high-powered machinery of this era. Nowadays we have a lot of high-powered machinery on land, in the air, at sea. But right now, as in back in 1800, this is it. This is what you're getting.
Her heaviest cannon were the 32-pounders of the lower gun deck. At point-blank range, these guns could punch through 2 feet of solid oak. Heavy breaching ropes held each gun in place. Otherwise, recoil would have sent 4 tons of gun and carriage flying across the deck after every shot. Each gun had a crew of between 10 and 14, which was divided in half if the ship needed to fire on both sides. Each crew was led by a gun captain. He was responsible for aiming the gun, his crew shifting its massive weight with handspikes, crowbars, and wedges.
Okay.
When he was on target, the gun captain either applied a slow match to the touch hole, or, as seen here, pulled a lanyard attached to a gun lock to fire the gun. To reload, one man first blocked the vent with his thumb or a stopper to prevent sparks getting into the barrel during loading. The barrel...
This all feels like a very just risky operation. I mean, obviously this is how it has to work. Not like there was an alternative, but this much gunpowder, these cannons, you know, just a stray spark or an explosion in the wrong place and everything blows. Not that that's a revelation, everybody knows that, but it is, you know, it's a dangerous thing, you know? You probably wouldn't want to think about it too hard.
Barrel was then sponged to extinguish embers and wormed to remove debris. A gunpowder cartridge was inserted at the muzzle and rammed home with a ramrod.
I mean, it's really, when you look at how it works, I mean, and I'm not an expert on the weapons of any era, so this may sound very silly, but some of the operations do seem similar to a musket, but, you know, sort of made larger. I mean, you know, there's the, you know, tabbing stuff in, pushing stuff. I mean, the operation in some ways is sort of similar. I'm not saying it's any more than a surface level similarity, but just seeing how they do it sort of reminds me of a musket of this era, just on a much larger scale.
Followed by the shot, and then a wad to keep everything in place. The gun was run out into firing position, and a pricker inserted into the vent to prick the cartridge and spill the gunpowder. The gun captain then added powder from his powder horn to the vent and priming pan. The gun was now primed, ready to fire again. This process took an experienced British gun crew around 90 seconds.
Wow.
They were generally faster and more accurate than their adversaries.
Yeah, that sounds impressive.
As a battle wore on, the firing rate would fall dramatically due to exhaustion and casualties. Conditions on a gun deck during battle must have been horrendous. Noise, smoke, sweat, and gruesome wounds caused by shot, flying wooden splinters, and accidents.
Yeah, I mean, same with really any warfare, but particularly in this era. You could think about land warfare, a battlefield. You know, you're on the field surrounded by your fallen comrades who have been hit by artillery, shrapnel, you know, bullets from your enemy. Just an extraordinarily brutal sight. You know, people bleeding out everywhere, lying on the ground, injured. Exactly the same thing here. It was definitely not a pleasant environment to be a part of course.
Battles usually began with a broadside, a ship firing all guns on one side in quick succession. For greater impact, the first broadside could be double-shotted, every gun loaded with 2 rounds.
Whoa.
To guarantee penetration of an enemy ship's hull, the range should be less than 500 yards. Many captains preferred extreme close range to fight yardarm to yardarm. The deadliest maneuver was to rake the enemy, to fire a broadside into their stem or stern. Round shot would smash its way the length of the ship.
You know, it really does seem, of course, that there is some maneuvering present, and I'm sure we'll get to more of that, but it does seem like a lot of whether you lost or won came down to the training and discipline of your crew. How fast could they load up those cannons and shoot them? Say if your crew is 10% faster than your enemies, particularly if you're fairly stationary or you're just firing at each other, it kind of seems like, same thing on land. If your soldiers are more disciplined, better trained, even a little bit more than your opponents, and you're standing and firing at each other, you're probably going to win this battle. Of course, there is room for more grand maneuvers and trickery and plans, but it does seem like it might be a little more straightforward at sea than on land. I'm not quite sure.
Dealing death and mayhem as it went. French ships tended to fire high, on the uproll, aiming for masts and rigging to immobilize the enemy. British ships aimed low, for the hull, trying to knock out guns and crew.
Really? Why did they have this difference in strategy? I'm curious as to why that developed, and would one side eventually take up the strategy of the other side?
At long range, a mile or more, round shot could be skipped across the sea, like skimming pebbles across a pond.
Wow. Same concept, I guess.
Round shot, a solid iron ball, was the most commonly used type of ammunition.
Yeah, that's what we're all familiar with, the classic cannonball that we all know from popular culture.
Specialist ammunition, such as bar shot, also known as double-headed shot or chain shot, was used to target masts and rigging. At close range, grape shot and canister, both packed with multiple smaller projectiles, turned a gun or carronade into a giant shotgun.
And that was very effective on land as well, of course. With artillery, that's Napoleon was an expert in. His very famous whiff of grape shot in Paris. He used grape shot very effectively to disperse some royalist rebels. Grape shot was a very prominent aspect of artillery on land, too.
And were used to wreak havoc on an enemy deck.
I can imagine.
A captain might decide to finish the fight by boarding an enemy warship. Designated boarders armed themselves with muskets, pistols, cutlasses, and half-pikes. The enemy ship was bound tight by grappling hooks, and after a shower of grenados and stink pots, an early form of tear gas, the boarders would swarm across to the enemy deck. In such actions, morale, aggression, and momentum counted more than tactics.
Yeah, it seems like a very chaotic situation, versus on land combat, which I think strategy would play more into. Tactics seems like in a boarding, like they said, it very much comes down to momentum and morale. Are your men willing to charge on board, fight as hard as they can, and keep fighting? Or do they have high morale? If so, then they're probably going to win. I can't imagine there's a lot of strategy going on in this violent, brutal, bloody melee that happens when you board another ship.
Though brutal, such battles were usually over quickly.
Yeah. Well, it's not like you're fighting in a large area. These ships are pretty big, but it's still a relatively small, confined zone. So I feel like it would be over extremely quickly. You just have to gain the upper hand. Life at sea.
Combat at sea was relatively rare. Great fleet actions, such as Trafalgar and the Nile, were rarer still. Just a handful of days, spread across 20 years of war. Weeks and months often lay between any encounter with the enemy.
In some ways it's similar to combat on land, though it seems that battles were even more infrequent at sea. If you were a land army, it was also true that you could go weeks or months without any battles. You just living, often living off the land, though Napoleon did have a hand in changing that. This is sort of true for a lot of things I say about combat of this era. you could say, well, Napoleon actually changed that. Of course, Napoleon was far more decisive, aggressive, and battled more frequently and more quickly than a lot of his contemporaries did. So, if you're fighting for Napoleon, if you're part of the Grand Armée, you're probably fighting more often than you would, say, a couple decades earlier, when armies were more willing to circle each other and not fight for months on end. But of course, it seems like it was even more infrequent at sea. The vast majority of what you're doing is just living your life, surviving at sea. And living, I think in many ways a pretty tough and hard style of life.
Then life at sea was dominated by naval routine, and the passage of time marked by the ship's bell. The naval day began at noon, determined by the officers' observation of the sun with their sextants. The moment the sun reached its highest point was noon.
Okay.
The ship's hourglass was turned, and the bell rung 8 times to mark the beginning of the afternoon watch. Half an hour later, as determined by a half-hour sandglass, the bell was rung once. A half hour later, it was rung twice, and so on. So 5 bells in the afternoon watch was 2:30 p.m. 8 bells meant the start of a new watch, sending half the crew below deck to rest or do other tasks, and
once again, as with all the terminology, it's just a different way of doing things at sea. And so if you're a new sailor, you've got a lot to learn. If you're just a regular seaman, perhaps pressed off the streets of some random port city, you're not very learned, you might not be able to read, it's not like you're reading up on all of this. You're going to have to learn and memorize as you go. That is a lot to keep in your head.
bringing the other half on duty. There were 7 watches in all, though the first and second dog watches were only 2 hours long. This meant the 2 halves of the crew switched their routine each day, and one half wasn't always stuck with the same night watches. Senior officers slept in a hanging cot. For everyone else, bed was a hammock strung up from the ship's beams.
Yikes.
Most of the men slept on the middle or lower gun decks, their hammocks suspended between the guns, just 16 inches apart. But as most ships operated a 2-watch system, half the crew on duty while the other half slept, about half the hammocks were empty at any given time.
Okay.
In normal conditions, only part of the watch was required to sail the ship. The rest carried out various tasks, not least cleaning the ship, scrubbing decks, polishing brass, and painting woodwork. This was a matter of maintenance and hygiene, as well as collective pride in their ship's appearance. The crew were fed.
Yeah, I mean, maintenance and hygiene would be extremely important in this very grimy, dirty, disease-ridden environment. Not that they understood germ theory at this point, so they don't really understand diseases, but, they understood hygiene was important, and we, looking back, understand even more how important hygiene is.
Fed 3 times daily, though only dinner at noon was a hot meal. They organized themselves into messes of about 8 men, each taking his turn to fetch cooked food from the galley, which was eaten at a table suspended between the guns. Naval food wasn't fancy, but it was sufficient, even for men engaged in long hours of hard labor.
Okay.
Apart from the ship's substantial stores of salted beef, pork, and ship's biscuit, the ship took on fresh meat, including livestock, fresh vegetables, and water at every possible opportunity. Most of the crew probably ate better at sea than they would have in civilian life.
Wow.
As well as the daily routine dictated by the ship's
I mean, that's pretty interesting. Now, don't think that that's because they wanted to treat these sailors super well. It's because they're working all day. They're doing so much physical labor that, of course, they need to be well fed. But, I mean, that's, of course, a good thing. It is pretty remarkable that they would have eaten better on ship than on land, but in many ways it makes sense. You get at least a regular diet of meals on this ship. You might not get that if you're a poor person on land. You're probably eating pretty infrequently. Not to mention you're doing so much labor that they do need to keep you well fed or everybody's going to collapse from exhaustion and hunger. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that does make sense actually.
Well, there were weekly rituals. Clothes and hammocks washed and hung out to dry once a week, weather permitting. Gunnery practice by divisions. And on Sundays, a church service led by the ship's chaplain, if there was one, or the captain.
Of course.
This was followed, at least once a month, by a public reading of the Articles of War, the regulations that governed conduct and discipline at sea. The articles listed 36 offences, from drunkenness to theft, mutiny, cowardice, and striking an officer. Half of these were punishable by death.
You know, it's a pretty strict ship they're running, like I said last time. And once again, this mostly comes from my knowledge of the early 18th century. But, you know, the ship was not organized, say, democratically. It was very hierarchical, and the captain was basically a tyrant over those below him. And so, you know, there were a lot of things that were punishable, and a lot of things that were punishable by death. Though, this isn't too different from life on land. You would be surprised if you look at some of the court records from this era. People are being sentenced to death or deportation for some really minor offenses. You're talking about, like, minor thievery. And people are being sentenced to execution for that. So a death sentence, particularly in the early to mid 1700s and before that, was a pretty common punishment for many different crimes.
In several cases, it was the only sentence allowed. British discipline at sea was notoriously severe.
Yeah, okay.
Crimes for which a sailor was not hanged would usually lead to a flogging with the cat o' nine tails.
Okay, so it seems like conditions had improved from the early 18th century, but that it was still extremely strict. You know, the captain was running a strict operation and often very brutal. And once again, I'll make the point, you imagine this, how strict, brutal this is. Now imagine it 100 years earlier and the conditions are even worse. It's not surprising why a lot of these men in the early 18th century went off to become pirates instead of being mistreated aboard these ships. Though, like I said, it does seem like conditions had improved throughout the century and were definitely better by the time we reached the Napoleonic Wars, though still very tough discipline.
Drunkenness was the most common offence, not unconnected to the Navy's daily allowance of a gallon of beer per man in a...
Yeah, I mean, everyone's going to be drunk. Probably the two most common drinks of this era are coffee and alcohol, and maybe tea. So everyone's drinking alcohol all the time.
Home waters, or half a pint of rum or other spirits overseas. This, mixed 4 parts water to 1 part spirits, with lemon or lime juice added to prevent scurvy, was the famous Navy grog.
It doesn't sound that good.
Any man caught drunk or asleep on duty might get 12 lashes, delivered by a bosun's mate in front of the assembled crew.
I feel like the emphasis there is on caught, because I imagine a lot of them were drunk on duty. You just had to make sure that you weren't caught being drunk on duty.
Serious crimes, such as desertion, might result in 200 lashes or more. A punishment so severe, it sometimes killed the prisoner.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Some naval captains were ferocious tyrants, but most knew that harsh punishment was best used sparingly.
Yeah.
British sailors did not expect an easy life, but did expect to be treated fairly and with dignity.
Okay.
If not, there could be trouble. In 1797, the Royal Navy experienced a large-scale mutiny at Spithead, affecting 16 ships of the line.
And mutinies were not uncommon for this era due to that brutality and discipline. And like I said, a lot of captains, had to be a little more reasonable to avoid pissing off the crew. But even at this point, and this was even more common, years before in earlier times, a lot of these captains behaved like tyrants, and they doled out punishment fairly frequently.
It was effectively a strike for better pay, as sailors hadn't had a pay rise in more than a century.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to make, and there's a lot of really interesting research on this, sort of the connection between sailors, also pirates, and workers' rights, because if you think about it, you're sort of getting to the advent of factories that'll start to occur in the late primarily early 1800s. And one of the, main changes from, prior to industrialization to industrialization is that you have all these workers grouped together in one factory. It makes it easier to organize. Now, if we're talking about the mid to late 1700s, that's still not really a thing. A lot of people are still in agriculture, and a lot of the working class, who most of them are peasants, are very spread out. An exception to that are sailors, whether they be on merchant ships, privateers, or on naval ships. Like a factory, it's all these workers grouped together. And so some researchers, some historians have written about this and sort of compared it to early sort of versions of workers' rights that would emerge in industrialized societies later. And like they said, these mutinies were kind of actually like strikes. And these mutinies were not necessarily uncommon. I'm not an expert on this, but there's a lot of really fascinating research on this topic, if that sounds interesting to you.
The mutiny was settled without violence, and the sailors largely got what they wanted. A second mutiny at the Nore made more radical demands, with some crews threatening to defect to France. This time, the authorities were determined to set an example and hanged 29 ringleaders.
And like with strikes, sometimes the company or government is willing to negotiate. Other times they put their foot down and they hang the ringleaders. So we're seeing that here.
Despite hard discipline and service, the British Navy produced crews that were experienced and able, bound together by long service at sea. Men that bold commanders knew they could rely on. The British Navy, well-manned, well-resourced, and backed by a powerful economy, was able to secure complete naval dominance during the Napoleonic Wars.
And I think conditions for sailors would continue to improve over time. And part of that was due to, one, I talked about how with Napoleon's Grande Armée, that was more than just an army of scoundrels and the lowest of the low who weren't respected. That was really a force that represented France, and people really believed in it. The soldiers themselves believed in the cause. And so as a lot of countries sort of copied that model of the citizen soldier, the military began to gain a lot more respect, and the soldiers began to gain a lot more respect. In addition, Britain's Navy is what enabled it to be, master of the world, the colonial master of the world. And so, of course, that institution was extraordinarily important, and people began to recognize that. So a lot more respect was given to the Navy, and I would imagine that did translate to perhaps better conditions or better treatment or more respect for the people on working the ships, though of course I'm sure discipline was still strict and conditions weren't necessarily great. I'm no expert on working conditions upon ships over time, but there definitely was a change in popular attitudes towards the Army and the Navy during this time.
It would prove a crucial factor in Napoleon's defeat.
Yeah, it would.
HMS Victory, having played her part, was placed in the Naval Reserve at the end of the war. Narrowly escaping the breaker's yard, she became the flagship of the Port Admiral of Portsmouth on England's south coast, and later flagship of the Royal Navy's Commander-in-Chief. After a major refit, Victory began a new life as a museum ship, opening to the public in 1928.
Wow.
Today, she is undergoing another major conservation project to deal with the many challenges faced by a 250-year-old wooden sailing ship. It will ensure her survival far into the future as a unique memorial to this dramatic age of naval warfare.
That's great. That's great.
Thank you to Royal Museums Greenwich for help in collating images for this video. Greenwich in southeast London has been at the centre of British naval history for centuries. And
shout out. I mean, it's really great that they're sort of making these partnerships in order to create these videos and get the sources they need for these videos. That's really awesome.
Is an essential visit for anyone with an interest in our maritime past. There you can...
Oh, look at that image. That is pretty striking. You know, we have this very impressive looking complex in this sort of natural setting with, you know, a skyline behind it. That's an impressive picture.
And visit the Royal Observatory, home of the Greenwich Meridian, the legendary clipper ship Cutty Sark, and the National Maritime Museum. Their galleries tell the story of Britain's long connection to the sea, a tale of exploration, empire, trade, and military power. Among the many highlights of the collection, the uniform Vice Admiral Nelson was wearing when he was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar. If you love maritime history, make sure you make a visit next time you're in town. Thank you also to Jack Fine Art and the estate of Derek Gardner for permission to use his paintings in this series. You can view many more of his fantastic artworks via the links in the description.
I'm letting them run through.
Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video.
All right.
Dive into the most comprehensive...
All right, thank the sponsor. There we go. Go check out their sponsor. Thank you to the museum, the art they used. You know, like I said, it's really nice to see a bunch of institutions coming together to help produce a project like this. I'm not particularly into maritime history, but I do love history. And the preservation of history, whatever history it is, that's always a good thing. So, hey, if you guys are in the area in the south of England, go and take a visit. It seems awesome. I'm glad that they're preserving the ship. You know, it's just really important stuff. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this. You know, great little series. You know, I enjoyed learning about the HMS Victory. Learned a lot of naval terms I did not otherwise know, or I might have heard of, but was unfamiliar with. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I certainly did. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.